We're quite happy that both of them are definitely available. One of the ways in which the ocean also functions is to set the tone for patience. It was almost a given that certain goods and ships would reach a tad bit late. The history of Indian Ocean is filled with delays. While we will not be embracing it ever again, I would also like to apologize to those who tried attending the session last week. For those who are attending afresh, well, you're in for some serious luck since we have a promising lecture awaiting us. The Indian Ocean Speaker Series is currently in its second phase. Indian Ocean and Beyond is jointly hosted by the Center for Inter-Asian Research, Ahmedabad University, and the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand. We have both Professor Tejaswini Niranjana and Professor Dilip Menon representing each center, and as always, it's an immense pleasure to have your support. Without further ado, I think Murari, please introduce our key speaker for the day.
Thanks, Savan. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be welcoming Professor Ghulam Ahmad Nadri this afternoon, who is going to give a very interesting talk on commodity production, commerce, and capitalism in 18th century Surat. Um, for those of you who do not know Ghulam Nadri, he's a professor of history at Georgia State University, Atlanta. He did his PhD at Leiden, and subsequently he was a Newton International Fellow at LSE. He published two very thoroughly researched book. The researched book first was on the 18th century Gujarat, the dynamics of its political economy. And the recent one is the political economy of indigo in India, a global perspective. He has written dozens of articles and book chapters, and he's teaching courses on South Asian history, Indian Ocean world, Asia in the world economy, and so on. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Ghulam Nadri to give his talk. Yes, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin with a vote of thanks to the organizers, to Murari especially, to Professor Niranjana, Professor Menon, and all the team. Safwan, I think I received your email at some point, so we couldn't keep that up, but now we know each other, so it's great. Great to be here with you all, and thank you again for asking me to be a part of this seminar series and share some of my thoughts that I've been thinking about over the last some years. I also apologize for the confusion last week. But I saw the flyer at a few minutes before 7:30 here, so there was no way I could join. So my apology for that. But again, thank you for being flexible and then rescheduling it today. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm also a little uncomfortable because Professor Menon is here, and much of my work and that I'm going to talk today is partly inspired by the book that he edited with Kavi Yastani, challenging the whole idea of capitalism as a European, modern European product, which I really liked, and that motivated me to rethink and revisit some of the work that I had done in the past on the economy of Gujarat and Surat, trade and merchant communities and their business world, and then try to see if we can look at it from a capitalist point of view and see if there was there were traces of capitalism or not. So this, what I'm going to talk today, is partly an exercise to look at the economy of Gujarat, in particular Surat, in the early modern period, from the capitalist point of view, and see what we get from there. My talk will have three main components. One would be, of course, Surat is the central part of this conversation. Partly because Surat was the most important, port on Western Indian coast, and for a variety of other reasons. Then I will move on to the commodity production and try to see what were the main features of commodity production and to what extent those features can be identified as capitalist, right, or capitalistic. The third part would be about commerce. So what role did commerce play, did trade play, especially maritime trade, play in the overall economy of Surat and Gujarat in this period? I'm particularly focusing on 18th century because in the 18th century, Surat emerges as a major producer of textiles. There was a concentration of industry in and around Surat, unlike Bengal, where it was very much widely spread out in the rural areas. So that's why I'm focusing on the 18th century. And the third part would be an attempt to understand how do we then characterize the economy, and how then capitalism fits in, and how that can work as a good framework to understand the economy of this period. And then I will share some of my concluding remarks, and then invite questions and comments from all. Let me now share the screen. Can you see the screen? Is everything okay? Can you see it? Okay, perfect. So why Surat? So that's the first thing that I would like to talk, and why Surat in the 17th century, early 17th century, rose to prominence in the Western Indian Ocean world. There were, of course, many factors that contributed to Surat's rise, and scholars have talked about that. I think there were the three main reasons, if I would argue, would be first, the access to an extensive hinterland, and to several feeder ports within the Gujarat port complex. That played a major role in the rise of Surat as a prominent port, because it was located at a place where it had access to an extensive hinterland, which was also very productive in terms of agricultural and craft production. And then Surat was also a part of what I call the Gujarat port complex. So there were ports like Bharuch and Cambay and Bhoga, Mandvi, and Kutch, and Navanagar. There were many ports which were feeding into Surat's trade, and that's why Surat was a part of that complex. Of course, it was the central part of that complex, which later on in the 19th century, Bombay takes over as the main port of that complex, and Surat loses its position. So that's the main one of the reasons why Surat became so prominent. Surat was also located at the intersection of the most productive regions of Mughal India and the maritime world of the Western Indian Ocean. So if you see the map here, you can see that Surat is located some 25 kilometers or 15, 16 miles away from the ocean or the sea, and that gave Surat an advantage because then it was very well connected with the hinterland and also had access to the maritime foreland, which then gave it a unique position to play a role in the economy. And the third is that it also had a commercial infrastructure which played a vital role in the rise of Surat as a commercial, as a major port city. Banking and agency services in particular played a vital role. You have a whole hierarchy of brokers and agents who were willing to serve the East India companies and also any other merchant who required or needed their services. So that's the commercial infrastructure then plays an important role. Surat was connected with the cities and regions of Malwa, Delhi, Rajasthan, Agra, and Awadh through caravan routes. There were two main routes, one through Ahmedabad, Baroch, Ahmedabad, Ajmer, and Agra, and the other through Burhanpur, Siranj, and Gwalior. So there were two main roads that connected Surat with the extensive North Indian hinterland. There were many other subsidiary land and water routes that again connected Surat with the agricultural hinterland. Murari knows much better about that because he has worked on the Ganges economy, how the regions they were connected through those land and water routes. Surat was very well connected, and you see the map here is a map of the route from Surat to Ahmedabad, and you see how all those places they were connected, of course, through the trade traffic. It was this connectivity of Surat with the hinterland and the forelands of the Indian Ocean world that attracted lots of merchants and merchant communities to it. And what we see here at the beginning of the 17th century, that European East India companies, we have the East India Company, the English and the Dutch, later on French, the Portuguese were already there. You have all other West Asian and Indian merchants, Gujaratis, Jains, Boras, Baniyas, you have Turkish, Arabs, Persians, all sorts of people, merchants came to Surat, and Surat became a home for all those merchants and merchant communities. So this connectivity plays an important role in it. Surat, throughout this early modern period, Surat plays two major roles. One is that it connects the Mughal Empire or the Mughal India with the world economy. We can call it early modern globalization. Surat plays a major role in it by connecting the Mughal North Indian hinterlands with the oceanic forelands. So that's the main role that Surat plays. And as a prominent port, it also plays a role by which the commodities, or the goods produced in the hinterland, they were exported to other parts of the world. And in return, then it receives large amounts of gold and silver and other commodities from around the world. So it was a major source of supply of silver and gold. That was vital for the stability of the Mughal monetary system or the fiscal system of the Mughal Empire, the currency circulation, and so on and so forth. So Surat becomes a major importer of gold and silver from West Asia and also later on from through the European East India companies. And in these two processes, like connecting Mughal India with the wider world and exporting commodities and importing vital goods like silver and gold, merchants and commodities, of course, play a major role. This is just to show how vital Surat was in terms of the supply of silver, calculated on the basis of records that we could get from the Dutch shipping records or shipping lists. You can see, in the mid 17th century, how much silver and gold came into it. This is not the exact calculation, but this gives a rough idea of how much silver and gold was brought into the economy through Surat. Here is the another calculation for the 18th century, late 18th century. So between 1768 to 1778, we have some 17.5 million rupees, silver rupees, were brought into Surat. So it becomes a major importer of gold and silver. Merchants, Surat was the home of a large number of merchants. And these merchants can be categorized into different groups. There were three main groups, I would say. One, of course, Asian merchants and ship owners. You have Gujarati, Banias, Boras, Turkish, Armenian, Persians, and others. Then you have the European merchants and companies, European East India companies. And then you have merchants who were intermediaries, brokers, bankers, suppliers, and so on and so forth. What is important is that these groups, they had a relationship of competition and complementarity. So one complemented the other. Of course, there were contestations, there were competitions, but in general, there was a complementarity among these groups. Merchants' primary economic role, as I already mentioned, was to export local manufactures, textiles, indigo, sugar, many other products, agricultural products as well, like cotton, and also grains. So these merchants, they were exporting those commodities. And of course, they imported gold and silver, bullion and coins into Surat. Also some industrial raw materials like lead, copper, quicksilver, tin, spelter, dyes, and sapanwood and other things. And also some consumables like raisins, dates, almond, coffee, and many other things that these merchants they brought from West Asia, from Southeast Asia, and other places. And these merchants then facilitated trade and commercial exchange on a large scale. Commodities, in the same way, played an equally important role. And here, I would like to move into to talk about commodity production and what were the main features of the production, and then that would lead us then to think about whether it was capitalistic or not. We all know that commodities. There were some commodities which were exported in large quantities. Textiles, of course, manufacturers, textiles and indigo. In the first half of the 17th century was the main item that the Europeans took to Europe. But textiles continued to be the most important commodity exported from Surat. Let me also mention here that Surat, like all other parts of Mughal India, was a capital-scarce economy. Capital was not easily available. And that's why this trade was so important, not only for the economy of Surat and Gujarat, but also the economy of Mughal India as such, because without the supply of continuous supply of gold and silver, it would be impossible for the Mughals to maintain their trimetallic currency system, especially the silver rupee. So this trade was vital, and that's why I tend to think that Surat, even if it was located on the periphery of the empire, was quite central to the existence of the empire as such. Commodity production, if we look at it, Gujarat, as we all know, was among the four major textile producing regions of India: Bengal, the Coromandel Coast, the Punjab, and Gujarat was among the four. commodity production or textile production was spread out in Gujarat. We have several textile producing centers within Gujarat. But by the middle of the 18th century, we see that there is a kind of growing concentration of the industry in Surat. And that creates different dynamics for the economy of Surat. It also plays out in the way that we see the English East India Company then tries to control the economy of Surat because the industry was located there. And the whole discussion of how then the industry responded and what happened to weavers and merchants and producers in general. But Surat's emergence as a major textile producing center is a major development. Merchants, European merchants, all other merchants, companies, they all depended in the second half of the 18th century for the supply of textiles on weavers, producers, and merchants in and around Surat. And then we see this is exactly also the time when the political economy of the region is transitioning into a colonial economy, and the role then that transition played in it. Now, what were the major features or characteristics of the textile production economy of Surat or Gujarat in general? A major strength of the textile industry in all production regions was the weavers' extraordinary ability to adjust the output to the local and external demand. So when the demand expanded, the weavers they were able to meet the requirement and expand production. So there was always this ability, extraordinary ability to match the demand with supply. Here you can see how the European exports of textiles from India expanded from the early 17th century to the late 18th century. You can see the Dutch East India Company exported somewhere less than 500,000 guilder worth of textiles. And it goes to over 10 million guilders by the 1770s. So it's also the expansion, the huge expansion in the European purchases of Indian textiles because of the fashion revolution or the calico craze or whatever that was happening in Europe, especially from the late 17th century period. So the qualitative and quantitative evidence from the Dutch and English records confirm that the industry was able to adjust the output. If the Europeans were able to export goods to these values, that shows that the weavers, they were able to expand their production and adjust the output to the demand. So that was an important feature of the industry. As we all know that the production in the 17th and 18th century, before in the pre-industrial period, was a small-scale household production. The independent weavers, they produced textiles. It was concentrated in urban areas, and that's a distinguishing feature of Surat. Surat's commodity production, because it was very much centered in urban areas like Ahmedabad, Cambay, Bharuch, Baroda, and then Surat, of course, emerges as a major producer. The system of advanced finance or forward buying, also known as the Gadani system, was a prominent feature of the textile industry in India during this period, and it worked for both weavers and merchants, the European companies. It was a risk-sharing mechanism. It guaranteed employment and income to weavers and assured merchants that they will receive the product in time. Right? So it worked for both the parties, merchants and weavers, both. The market structure, the nature of consumer demand, and the monsoon circumscribed trade made such contracts desirable for both parties, right? Because um, time was a major factor. Right? So Europeans had to make sure that that the ships sailed out of Surat in time, or they had all the commodities that they wanted to export in time. That required that they had to have some sort of advanced buying system, advanced contract system with the weavers. And that advanced buying or advanced finance became a major, an important feature of the industry. Merchant capital, because of this nature of the market, merchant capital played an important role. So merchants would advance cash to weavers, and the weavers then produce goods and deliver to the lender, right, to merchants. If we go into the details of how the industry was structured, we can see that caste identity, product specialization, and the division of labor existed in the industry. Those were the structural features, and I have discussed that more in detail in the article in Historia Critica. How the industry was structured and how different castes had designated roles, production roles to play in it. I'm not suggesting that they were caste specific, or there were a kind of professional mobility very much. People could move from one profession to another. Really, they did throughout this period. But in general, there was this kind of a specific specialization that we see along the caste lines. You can see the table here. There were 15,777 looms counted in Surat at the end of the 18th century, and you can see the classification of people who were involved and how many looms they held. You know, you have Muslims, you have Parsis, you have different castes among Hindus and Muslims who were all producing different types of textiles in Surat and also in other parts of the country. Throughout this period, capital and labor were in a dynamic relationship, which was again complementary and also contestatory. Merchant capital played a vital role in commodity production, including textile manufacturing. But what rendered it so significant and relevant in the economy was the labor that produced textiles for the market. One depended on the other, so merchants had to depend on weavers and other producers. And the merchants' desire to obtain goods at the lowest possible prices, and the producers' longing for a fair reward for their work rendered this relationship contentious sometimes. So because of the expectations of profit on both sides, rendered this relationship contentious sometimes, but overall there was this kind of symbiosis or a relationship of interdependence and complementarity that we see in the industry. What distinguishes Surat from Bengal or the Coromandel Coast is that despite the fact that merchant capital played an important role, a vital role in the industry, the capital or merchants, and when I say merchants, I also include the East India companies, they were not able to dominate the relationship between weavers and merchants. Weavers continued to exert or exercise their autonomy throughout this period. Even in the 19th century, the East India Company had to struggle to make sure that the producers produced for them. Something that they had been able to easily do in Bengal and on the Coromandel Coast. Textile production was the largest and the most dynamic manufacturing sector in the economy of early modern Gujarat. Its structural and organizational features, such as the division of labor, product specialization, and advanced buying, were deep-rooted and greatly contributed to the industry's ability to produce a large variety of textiles for the local and global markets. So all these features contributed to the success of the industry throughout this period and the ability to meet the demand. We now move on to trade, and then talk about some prominent merchants of Surat and the role that they played in linking Surat and Mughal hinterland with the foreland of the Indian Ocean world, and then move on to our last segment, which is about an attempt to understand how do we characterize the economy. As I mentioned, that Surat by the mid 17th century or even earlier had emerged as a major, as a home for a large number of merchants. Right? So what we see in Surat is a kind of wide range of commercial operations. There were merchants, there were ship owners, there were bankers, brokers, agents, suppliers. There are lots of commercial operations going on. And there were, of course, the merchant princes, right? Those who monopolized merchants. Some of them we know very well. Abdul Ghaffur, for example, or Rustamji Manekji, or many others. They were corporate, buyers of textiles or corporate traders. So you have those monopolist traders, operating like big corporations on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also have peddlers and retailers and shopkeepers, petty traders, and so you have a wide range of activities, but also a wide range of merchants who were involved in all sorts of activities. In Surat, we also see the presence of exceptionally rich and resourceful merchants. I mentioned Abdul Ghaffur, we know about him and many others. Those merchants who were engaged in maritime trade, banking, and brokering, or a combination of all. They owned large private properties, ships, houses, land, etc., and invested their capital in trade, finance, and other businesses to further accumulate capital. Right? So here we see what Wallerstein talks about, this endless accumulation of capital. If you follow the life trajectory of these merchants, you can see that they were constantly accumulating capital through trade primarily, but also through other businesses. I'm not going to talk about merchants that I wanted to. You have V.G. Vora, again, another monopolist merchant who had for several decades in the 17th century monopolized the whole pepper trade in Surat, and he had his own network that controlled this pepper supply chain from Kerala to Surat, from the Malabar coast to Surat, and the supply to the East India companies. You have one example is V.G. Vora, but I would like to focus on two most prominent merchants of the late 17th, early 18th centuries. One is, of course, Rustamji Manekji, a Parsi merchant, who built his fortunes through trade by investing in trade and in money market. So he was the broker of the English East India Company for several decades. He accumulated large capital through trade and finance and invested primarily in merchandise and bonds, but also in other commercial ventures. He was also a ship owner, investing in maritime insurance like Respondentia and Bottomry. He was also a very trusted ally of the East India Company and handled its finances, right, and financial transactions, and represented the company at the Mughal Custom House and ensured that the company's goods were cleared for imports and exports. So he played a very important role in the trade of the East India Company. And again, you can see here the the extent of his financial dealings with the East India Company, running into millions of rupees in the early 18th century. So that is one example that we see here, Rustamji Manekji. If we look at Abdul Ghaffur again, he's a corporate merchant, right? He's a big businessman. He owns more than 17 ocean-going ships, and on the screen you can see the 17 of his ships are listed in the early 18th century, 1702, that he owned. Some of them, they were huge ships. There are other reports which say that he owned more than 2 dozens. He traded with West, East, and Southeast Asia, so he had a very wide-ranging access to the Indian Ocean world. And that, again, he plays an important role in connecting Surat and Mughal India to the Indian Ocean world and in early modern globalization. So his ships frequently sailed to Mocha, Jeddah, Basra, Gomrun, Bandar Abbas, Aceh, Malacca, Manila, Bantam, all places. You can see the map here, which shows the dots that his business world was spread out almost throughout the Indian Ocean world. Now, Abdul Ghaffur was not simply a ship owner, but he was a capitalist. Right? He owned huge capital. And there's the shipping list shows the ships coming from in this case, Aceh, and the other one from Bantam. And it lists all the goods that it brought into Surat. The Dutch shipping lists are very useful for the 18th century, especially Gujarat or Surat trade. Here is Alexander Hamilton writing in the early 18th century about Abdul Ghaffur, right? And it shows how much capital he had and how he invested his capital in those ships and trade during this period. Now, I've compared the two in a chapter that I wrote for a book that Tirthankar Roy and Chaya Goswami and I are editing, where I compare these two merchants and their business strategies and practices. And what I saw is that both Rustamji Manekji and Abdul Ghaffur, they shared the same maritime space, lived under similar political and social regimes, and had some common entrepreneurial traits. Yet they differed from each other in one major respect. So they were both businessmen, prominent ones, but they differed in one major respect. And that was that Rustam Manekji was an ally of the East India Company. Right? And he dealt with the East India Company as its brokers. Whereas Abdul Ghaffur, he's being a ship owner, was a competitor of the Europeans. And that's why he was most of the time at odds with the Europeans, East India Company. So that was a major difference between the two here. Their professional outlook and business worlds reveal the wide spectrum of entrepreneurial possibilities and professional skills, strengths, and ambitions in a port city like Surat in late Mughal India. Right? These two figures, they also show what could be possible in a port city like Surat in the 18th century, early 18th century, when the empire was almost empire had begun to collapse or disintegrate from the late 17th century. So that's an important thing. A major difference I see is that each of them represents a different business model. Right? So Rustam Manekji's model is more resource and service oriented, or service intensive. Right? So he is exploiting his resources, his contacts, his networks, and his services. Right? Whereas Abdul Ghafur's model is more capital intensive. He's not borrowing money from anyone. He's not lending money to or investing in the money market for a variety of reasons. But he's investing his own capital. Of course, owning ships itself is an index of huge wealth and capital that he owned. So I do see that these two represent two different models of doing business. I will skip. There's another Dutch merchant that I wrote about, who was a broker of the Dutch East India Company. And you follow him, it's the same thing that you see. He's a ship owner, he's a trader, and a kind of monopolist buyer. Most of the time in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s, he is the buyer of commodities that the Dutch bring into Surat. Most of the time. So he holds a kind of monopsony so far as the sale of the Dutch imports was concerned. Now, the question is that there were so many others, hundreds of merchants like these who were involved in maritime trade, in banking.
Professor, we sort of lost you for the past two sentences. That's more or less which was said. If you could just repeat, really sorry.
I was talking about the two business models that Mancherji, that Rustamji Manekji and Abdul Ghafur represented in Surat. Manekji model is more based on the exploitation of the resources he had, the services that he and his network could offer. So it was more resource and service intensive model that Rustam Manekji presented. Whereas Abdul Ghafur's model was a capitalist model. It was capital intensive trade that he was involved in, investing his own capital in ships and merchandise and overall trade. And then you have, I talked about another Parsi merchant, Mancherji Khurshedji, that I wrote about some years ago, who was a broker of the Dutch East India Company. And he, like Virji Vora or Rustam Manekji, held a kind of monopsonic position insofar as the sales of the Dutch imports were concerned. So he was always the ultimate buyer of the merchandise that the Europeans brought. He was involved in the contracts that the Dutch made with suppliers of textiles and so on and so forth. A very powerful position that he had. He was a ship owner and also traded with other parts of the world. And there were so many others like him or like them in Surat who were involved. Now, the question is then what enabled these merchants, and hundreds of them, to carry out trade and other businesses and accumulate capital on such a large scale? What was it that contributed to that? And then I move into the answer. If I try to look at it, I find that it was the market economy of Surat, with its characteristic commercial and financial institutions, that contributed to this kind of situation in which all these merchants they could accumulate capital and carry out their businesses and trades. Of course, the embeddedness of and complementarity among the various branches of the economy played an important role as well. Right? So there was this kind of nexus of production, trade, finance, and service. All these factors combined together to make what Surat stood for in the 18th century. There is the complementarity among all these producers, merchants, financial bankers, and service providers, brokers and agents. They all complemented each other to make Surat and its merchant community so vital and so prominent in international commerce. Advanced buying, as we have already discussed, through contract and credit financing. That's where the role of bankers came in. We are all familiar with the sophisticated tools that they had hundi, right, the letters of exchange or bills of exchange, were instruments to transfer funds, but also to create credit for merchants or companies, whosoever looked for it. These professions were mostly controlled by the Banias and to an extent by Parsis. We don't see Muslim merchants so much into this. But these the sarrafs or sahukars, they played an important role in this market economy. Commercial intermediation, like brokers, agents, and suppliers, again, they played an important role in this. So how do we then characterize the economy? I also would like to talk later on about the labor and land market. We also have a labor market in Surat, which is quite dynamic. Land also is a marketable, is a commodity in Surat, as in many other parts of India. So what we see is the commodification of land and labor in Surat, in Gujarat, and other parts of India at that time, which again is a characteristic feature of capitalism. Now, moving on to the question, how do we then characterize the economy of Surat? To me, it seemed that Surat exemplifies a market economy in which capital was really accumulated, primarily through trade, privately owned, and invested in ships, bonds, commodities, and all other commercial ventures with prospects of profit or income. Right? That's why we see hundreds of merchants, they are investing in trade. So accumulation of capital and the private ownership of wealth, they are the essential features of this market economy. This is an economy with a relatively stable set of formal and informal rules governing merchants and markets, and in which merchants competed, colluded with each other, and also complemented with each other in myriad ways. So it's an economy which is very complex, in which these merchants, suppliers, brokers, bankers, they all complemented and competed with each other. It's an economy with a commercial infrastructure, which included a market for goods, labor, land, and capital, a money market or banking system with currency exchange, credit, and remittance services, facilities, a very efficient network of brokers and agents. For any merchants, it was easily possible to hire a broker or depend on a broker and get the business going. And all these things, what do these three features suggest? That every transaction that took place, whether it relates to commodities or money or service, they were all mediated by money and the market. Everything was involved money and the market. Another thing that I like to mention is this practice of writing down all major commercial transactions on paper. Sometimes we are given the impression that merchants, they were not, into documenting their transactions, and that's why we don't know much about their activities, and we have to depend on European archives for most of our information. That has some validity in a way, but if we dig a little bit deeper into the archives, and we do find that there was a strong tradition of writing down all commercial transactions. And here I have shown a few examples of how those transactions were documented. And the one in the middle is a early 17th century Taqavi contract, a small loan of 8 Mahmudi, right? 8 Mahmudi was documented, was written down. So that shows the tendency or the practice among economic actors to write down. Then on the one hand, you have a complaint made by a merchant. On the right side of the screen, you see a power of attorney that merchants issued or in the name of other merchants. And this, I have studied this power of attorney in an article in Jesho. If you are interested, you can look at it for more details. But the point that I'm trying to make is that transactions were documented, they were written down, primarily as an evidence. If a breach of trust occurred, if a controversy or a conflict occurred, then these documents could be used as evidence by merchants. And there are so many cases, recorded cases of conflicts and the presentation of these documents. Now, the question is, do these features represent a form of capitalism? How much time do I have?
Almost, maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, do these features represent a form of capitalism? That's the question that I want to explore. Now, there is a huge literature on capitalism. I think Professor Menon knows more than I do. That challenges the received wisdom that capitalism was a European, Western European, modern European product. And then there are various features that many scholars have talked about, they have listed, which includes the complex production system, division of labor, advanced contracts, product innovation, technology, new technology, contract enforcement mechanisms, and so on and so forth. Do we find these features in the economy of Surat? And I would like to share some of the things that I have found or I have noticed when I studied the commodity production or trade in Surat in the 18th century. The first is, although on a small scale and at the household level, textile manufacturing was a complex enterprise. Producing a textile was not a simple exercise. It's a very complex exercise. Weavers and artisans had to pool their capital and labor resources, skills, and raw materials to produce textiles for the market. It's a complex enterprise. They produced it independently. Right? Of course, they borrowed money from merchants, but they owned their product, unlike the putting out system in Western Europe. So they produced it independently, they owned the output, and shared the risks and rewards of the market. That's very clear if we see the textile industry in Surat. Similarly, trade, whether it's maritime or overland, was a complex enterprise. It's not easy to do. Merchants, again, like artisans, had to pool resources, capital, labor, and expertise, skills, and calculated, or at least had a sense of risks and rewards. That's what they do have to calculate the risks and rewards in order to carry out trade. So it was a complex enterprise. Merchants took business-related decisions independently. Right? So nobody told them to do. It was their own decision to do. Although there were some other factors like religion, caste, community considerations that helped them make those decisions. But in the end, it was their own decision. They accumulated large capital. We all know Manikji, Ghulam we have seen, or hundreds of other merchants. They accumulated large capital, and all transactions of goods, labor, capital, and services were mediated by money and market. So market is very central in the entire functioning of the economy. So money and market, they are two. So anything was available, everything was available for purchase: services, goods, labor, um, and money itself, right? The money market. The two main features of capitalism, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, are number one, private ownership of capital and other means of production. Right? So that's the first feature of capitalism. And the second is the free market enterprise, right? That the production takes place for the market. Both of these features were present in the economy of Surat. You have there were other features like the division of labor, product specialization, manufacturing innovations, provision for credit and advance cash payment, forward buying, and formal written contracts. These are all features of a capitalistic economy. So Surat was the site where the extensive, economic activities took place, which shared many of the characteristics which are associated with pre-industrial European capitalism: product innovation, division of labor, private ownership of capital and means of production, and so on and so forth. All those things were present in the economy of Surat. The other thing that that has not been done in the literature that we have is that this commercial capitalism of Surat was very much embedded into the agrarian capitalism of the hinterland. And when we talk of trade and commerce, we don't generally talk about agriculture or agrarian situation. I think that they are two very much embedded and need to be explored. Right? So one cannot be understood without the other, especially in the case of Surat, because Surat was a site where the extensive agrarian hinterland intersected with the maritime forelands of the Indian Ocean world. Right? So after all, the products like textiles, they were produced by processing agricultural goods like cotton or indigo or sugarcane or other things, right? So all those commodities that were exported in the agricultural hinterland. Finally, which I think the main arguments that I would like to share is that the peasant-led agrarian capitalism in early modern Gujarat played a vital role in the development of Surat's market economy due to its proximity and connectivity with the cotton and indigo producing regions like Bharuch, Sarkhej, Dholka, Baroda, Navsari, Cambay, Bhavanagar, Kutch, and Navanagar. Surat was the center of this production and commercial complex because of its connectivity, and served as a node of early modern capitalism in Western India and the Western Indian Ocean world. And I'm now I'm very much interested in the idea of agricultural or agrarian capitalism, and I'm inclined to take it as my next project to look at how this commercial capitalism was embedded in the agrarian capitalism of the hinterlands. Here I would stop, and thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Nadri. It was a great talk, very rich, giving us kind of very ground zero picture of what was happening in Surat through the experiences of Abdul Ghaffur and the other Rustamji, Manikji, as well as Jamsetji, Khurshedji. So I have a question. And if while others are thinking, can I perhaps go and ask my question, and then perhaps I can open the floor for others to ask question. Okay, so here is it. So, there's kind of whole lot of literature on origins of capitalism, whether it's kind of okay, yeah. Uh, okay, I can see a couple of hands. So I'll so you talked about the um, institutions, infrastructure, uh, and all those things that helped these merchant capitalists to actually hold the capital, move it, and deploy it in different instruments and different ways. Um, Abdul Ghaffur being kind of, as you said, almost a rival of the European companies. Um, so So I wonder whether you also look at similar phenomenon elsewhere from Asia, where we can compare the things that we know of Surat, let's say somewhere in Southeast Asia or East Asia or in the Red Sea zone, where so I suppose Abdul Ghaffur is not a unitary example. There could be many more who were dependent on the institutions or market infrastructure that could allow them to hold that much capital and move it from one place to other or deploy it in different ways. Uh, so I think that that will be wonderful to know how it compares.
Mm.
And in terms of the existence of these institutions and infrastructure, uh, how do you then compare it? Because of course, Indian Ocean region has a long history of such institutions where capital could move beyond the, quote unquote, national territories transnationally from one place to another or uh, across different territories of the kingdoms and qualities. Um, so now, finally, how Marathas uh, were kind of, or Maratha incursions were uh, kind of, whether that was affecting these capitalists or institutions in a negative way, or how Marathas were perhaps finding them an allies or something that to seek cooperation for the capital and so these are my thoughts. I don't know if I'm able to structure my question properly, but it will be great if we can reflect on some of this.
So thank you very much. As I understand, there were two. One is about comparisons
Yeah.
across the Indian Ocean world. Again, I would refer to the EUI project on notes of early modern capitalism. So
Mm.
what it does, it looks at various ports of the Indian Ocean world and examines their strengths, their limitations, and what role did they play, those ports play. Um, Commercial infrastructure is, of course, a significant part of it. We can't have trade or on that scale without those infrastructures in place. Surat had those infrastructures. So also other ports like Hormuz, if you look at it, or Mocha, Bandarabad, they all had those facilities, brokers, bankers, they were everywhere. What was also important is what sustains a port. You have to sustain a port for a longer time. The advantage with Surat was that it was connected with the one of the most productive regions of Mughal northwestern India. Right? So it was the hinterland that produced those commodities that provided the sustenance to Surat. And therefore, even if you have the Marathas coming in the 1660s and 70s, only temporarily affects trade and disrupts the normal economic activities. But then life goes on. It returns to normalcy soon after that because the hinterland is backing it up, right? And the infrastructure is there. So the combination of all those things. There are many ports which became very popular, very prominent, but they didn't have that kind of sustainability. Right? Hormuz is one example. It was very prominent at one time, but then soon it lost its prominence because it didn't have access to the hinterland, productive hinterland as Surat had, or some other like Hooghly or other ports had, Calcutta later on, or Madras had to that extensive hinterland. So I think that's an important point to be made, and comparisons are always good. Sometimes we ask questions. There's something was Surat unique? Was Surat exceptional? It is not. It's not an exceptional port city. What is exceptional is that you do see the emergence of merchants like Abdul Ghaffur that you normally do not see in other port cities, not on that scale. So that's one thing. The Marathas again is a again depending on one's point of reference. There are studies which show the Marathas, no economy, no state would like to see the economy in decline. So they will not do everything to make sure that trade continued, and especially because silver was so vital. The import of silver was so vital for the economy. The states, including the Mughals, they just couldn't afford to ignore international or global trade, especially the Europeans. Things change when there are problems in the hinterland, and again, in many cases, those are also temporary. My argument is that Surat, despite all crises in the political economy of the mid and late 18th century, it continues to be doing well. And even when Bombay emerges as a major port city in the early 19th century, it's Surat that is providing everything to Bombay. Right? Financial services, goods, and market, and access to market, because Bombay didn't have its own internet. So Surat continues to be vital. So I think we need to look at these places in a kind of more holistic way. And that's the problem that we have. When we focus on commerce and maritime trade, we ignore and I also include myself in that. I looked at maritime trade. I didn't look at the hinterland and the agrarian conditions.
Okay, thank you. So I think, okay, Dilip has question. So maybe Dilip, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Ghulam. That was a wonderful paper with a great deal of texture, and you're obviously a master of the local economy in many senses, the hinterland and the merchants and the connections through Dadani with the production and so on and so forth. My questions actually will try and pull you out of Surat a bit. Because if you think about the older paradigm of Indian Ocean studies, for example, if you think about the work of K.N. Chaudhary or Ashin Dasgupta and so on, the Indian Ocean is a hermetic space, right? I mean, it's not connected to the Atlantic Ocean, it's not connected to the Pacific Ocean. You do bring in silver, which actually takes us beyond the Indian Ocean, right? The trade in silver that's coming via Philippines is also via the Western Indian Ocean. So, and the other thing that is part of an older paradigm is the exclusion of Africa, right? Africa just doesn't appear. And of course, K.N. Chaudhary didn't think of it as a civilizational space, but that's another. So what I want to ask is, the first question I want to ask is a lot of the new work, let's say by Thomas McDowell, Pedro Machado, Jeremy Prestholt, all of them are trying to connect the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. also bringing in the question of slavery, that Gujarati merchants on the coast were connected with the slave trade. So Kathiawar, for example, sees a lot of slaves coming in for the local princes and so on. So what I want to ask is, if we think about the Surat merchants, they're tremendously wealthy and so on, did they have a role to play in this slave trade? Because as we know, it's a combination of Portuguese and Arab merchants, Gujarati financiers, South American silver, African consumers, right? There's a whole network across the two oceans that we need to think about. So a simple question, but I think it's also pointing to larger. Were Surat merchants involved with the slave trade, tangentially, directly, etc., etc.? That's the first question. The second question, and this relates to your question of capitalism, actually, right? I mean, if you think about slavery underlying capitalism, Eric Williams's famous argument, then this actually brings in the Indian angle into it. The second question is, one of the things about capitalism is also a certain kind of gratuitousness. The Surat merchants were characterized by philanthropy. Douglas Haynes's work, right, shows us that. So how do we bring in this question of philanthropy into this question of thinking about capital in Surat? That not all of it was instrumental, in terms of feeding weavers, building ships, trading gold, silver, and so on. That there is a notion of a civic capitalism that the Surat merchants are interested in, and which is worth thinking about. The third question relates to the wonderful distinction that you drew between Rustam Manekji and Abdul Ghaffur, the merchant prince. Now, the question here is that if we move away from the snapshot and lengthen the story, right, and move towards the realm of tragedy, right, a lot of these guys just vanish, right? Where is Abdul Ghaffur? Right? And similar, this happens on further down the coast. Ashin Das Gupta writes about Ezekiel Rahabi, another merchant prince. Within a generation, his descendants are beggars in Cochin. Right? So all that money just goes away. So when we think about capitalism, I think we also have to think about this question of a sustainable capitalism and what happens to these merchants. So when we talk about Surat, of course, we can relate it to political fortunes. You can relate it to the demise of the Mughal Empire, demise of Marathas, growing strength of the East India Company, and so on and so forth. But there's something here about the fragility, right? And how do we think about that if you have to use the term capitalism? Because it's not sustained over a period of time. And so these are the three questions. I just wanted to draw you out of the picture that you were speaking.
Right. Thank you so much again for these very thought-provoking questions. Slavery, yes, Surat merchants, they were involved in slave trade, especially if I remember correctly, the shipping list actually lists slaves who were brought into Surat, and I remember there's one ship that brings 600 slaves
Yes.
In the middle of the 17th century or so. And again, if I'm correct, I remember it correctly, it was one of the Mughal ships that was returning from Mocha. So yes, we do have references to slave trade.
And this continues into the early 19th century, right? It continues for a long period, into the early 19th.
So in the 19th century, again, you have lots more references to Indian merchants, the Parsis in particular, Kachhi Bhatiyas and other Khojas. They were involved in slave trade in Aden, in Zanzibar, and other places.
Right.
And there's a whole kind of archives on how they were they were kind of trying to circumvent the English attempt to suppress slave trade. So there's a whole kind of archival sources. Nobody has worked on those. I think that's very important. But in the 19th century, certainly they were involved in that. But even in the 17th century, slavery was, they were involved in slave trade. So that was one thing. About capitalism and philanthropy. Yeah, again, that's an interesting aspect of capitalism, especially if you look at the big merchants like Abdul Ghaffur or Rustam Manekji, or later on you have the Jijibai, Jamshedji Jijibai, and all others. They were well-known philanthropists of their times. And the way I look at it, that philanthropy is also an investment that they had to make, right? And it's an investment, as you rightly mentioned, social capital. You have this civic or social capital that was equally important, because trade was a collective enterprise. You have to have people in the network who could be reliable, who are trustworthy. And the best way to cultivate that kind of network of people is to invest in these philanthropic works, so that you build your social capital. Abdul Ghaffur financed building of mosques and power in Mocha. He had a house actually in Mocha. In Surat also, he did those things. The Parsis, Rustam Manekji plays an important role when the Parsis, they were exploited by the officials who were out there to collect jizya from non-Muslims. When Aurangzeb reimposed jizya in 1679, Rustam Manekji comes to rescue those Parsis of Surat. So they do these kinds of philanthropy, but there's an element of social capital and the expectation in the long run that will pay back. So and it's also interesting to see that how in this early period you have them building mosques or fire temples or other religious cultural things. But as in the 19th century, they move on to more educational, they build hospitals, schools, and other public utility projects. So that's another interesting aspect, and unfortunately, we don't have a good literature on that to discuss philanthropy and capitalism together, because by definition, philanthropy is a kind of counterproductive capitalism. But social capitalism, building social capital was equally important, and that's where we see most of those philanthropic spending going on. The intergenerational transmission of capital, again, that's a huge topic and a very interesting one. Many years ago, I confronted this idea of Ashindas Gupta about this, that the fortunes are built, but they are quickly disappearing, right? They disappeared very quickly. And I studied some, 3 merchant families of Surat in an article, where I saw that, Abdul Ghaffur, for example, his generation goes on from the 1660s all the way to the end of the 18th century. So it goes over, with the kind of all ups and downs in the cultures, but the business and the family business goes on for more than 120 years or so. So was the case with the Parekh family that served as brokers to the East India Company. And I traced the intergenerational transmission of capital from in this family. So there were families that survived, but in general, you are right. There was not this kind of longevity in this in capitalism. So then, the question is, how does capitalism then survive? But I think that's the nature of capitalism. So even in Europe, the life of individual families was no longer than a few decades or in some cases maybe 100 years or so. But we have equally long lasting families. The difference, I think, was there were two things that must be mentioned. One is that the investments, the capitalist or capital investments, they continued to be personal in the Indian case. Right? There was no supra-personal or impersonal kind of emergence of firms where the capital is invested that will go across generations. That doesn't happen. The moment a merchant dies, the empire is in disarray, and the capital is withdrawn, and then everything collapses. But again, similar things happened in Europe as well. I mean, I see in the 19th century United States too, we see the constant circulation of capital, merchant firms. They are built and then they disappear. So this is a nature of capitalism as such. So that's one thing, that the Indian merchants, they couldn't develop firms that could go beyond the person who invested in that firm. And that's a very typical of Indian business system. The other is, and which I think is important to mention, is that unlike Europe or other Western countries, merchants could accumulate wealth, but there was no legal safety of the ownership. There was no legal guarantee that their wealth will not be taken away from them. And we have so many examples. We mentioned the Maratha. When the Maratha incursion occurred, they took away the wealth. Birji Vora actually became bankrupt, and so many others. So, and that's something that goes on and on throughout the 18th century. And that's where I think we need to think about it, that why there was no legal guarantee that anybody's capital would be secure. And possibly that was the reason why they were not into investing in something that was not personal. And because if something happened, then they could easily pull their capital, do something else. It's also one of the strengths of it, that the capital is not stuck in a business for longer period. But that's something that we need to think about it. Why the states failed to provide the kind of legal safety or guarantee to the capitalists, to merchants who owned capital. It was always fragile. A change of regime might create a big problem. Right? And that's where I think the social capital becomes important. You see that Rustam Manekji, Abdul Ghaffur, other Turkish merchants, they owned their farmhouses, right? And where they hosted all those dignitaries in order to cultivate good relationship with the people who were in positions of power. So social capital was more important perhaps in those times where there were no legal safety available for them. So that would be my take on it. But again, this is something that needs further investigation.
Thank you.
Did I miss anything? Or?
No. I mean, I think these were comprehensive answers. I mean, is this failure of mercantile capital to make the transition to industrial capitalism? That's another big question.
That's another. Although I do see that the distinction itself is problematic. Because there's never a time when it shifts to industrial capital. People continue to do things that they used to do. Commercial capitalism continues in the 19th century. Industrial capitalism emerges as a new form, but people often make that distinction, which I have some problem with that. The same goes with early modern.
Right.
What is early modern about early modern capitalism? I raised this question in the discussion in Florence. We had a good discussion on that. Because many of those forms of early modern capitalism, they still continue today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So where's the end point of one and the beginning of the other? It's always a problem.
Mhm.
Thank you for I think you mentioned Man's book in the chat. Let me see.
Do we have any more questions? Okay. On intergenerational wealth, there is a new book by Sudev Seth,
Yes,
where actually he deals with the continuity of this Hari Bhakti family.
right.
Can you put in the chat, please? Can you put the name of the book in the chat?
Yeah, I haven't seen the book, but he did write to me that the book is coming out, so I will look forward to reading it. Bankrolling Empire. Yeah. The other thing I would say is that we also most of the time are dismissive of a state in economic history. And in my Gujarat book, I also argued that Mughal state is a weak entity when it comes to market and economy. But I think we need to rethink about the role of a state in a more kind of positive way. And especially the capitalism as a framework, it allows us to do that. That's what I find so fascinating, to look at it from the capitalist point of view, because it allows us to explore the relationship between capital and other, forces, labor, service, and land and other things, but also between capitalists and other actors like a state, which I think is something missing from the narrative. The role of the Mughals and the Maratha. I think Burton Stein wrote about the Marathas, or Frank Perlin, but
right.
After that we don't have much in the name of the literature. Kind of revisionist literature we need.
Yeah, that was a big paradigm 30 years ago, the 18th century. Right. Now it's
exactly. So I think in my new proposition, I'm now trying to look at both the agrarian capitalism and the role of state,
right.
Because I do think that the really states played an important role in that. And that's also a point that we can compare with how the European states provided the kind of safety network or even military support to this company. We don't see those things from the Indian side in general. What role did that play then? That kind of, the separation or the gap. That's important to explore.
All right. So I think it's a wonderful conversation. Although I still think that the transition from wealth to power did not get completed, I think, in many of those instances where it seems the safety of capital, perhaps an alignment with power was essential. I mean, of course, they did everything in Bengal and elsewhere to cling to power, but
power was more fragile than capital.
Yeah. So, well, thank you very much, Professor Nadri, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming for this talk. And as a convener, I would like to apologize for the things that happened a week ago. I think I should have taken the charge, but some miscommunication. So once again, apologies. And we'll now I think Savan, you have to.
Well, yeah. So it's just a quick announcement. So 23rd this month, we have Professor Krishnendu Ray from New York University, delivering a lecture on perhaps one of the best titles we have seen till date in our webinar series. And it goes like this: Pan flows against the gradient of power. Yes, you've heard that right. We are talking about the masticate or betel nut chewing. So inviting you to a fantastic session. Thank you and see you all again.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And please add me to your mailing list.
Mailing list, sure.
I receive the links and I will try to join as much
Thanks.
as
And great to catch up with you, Ghulam, after so many years.
Good to see you. Yes, great.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, let me know if you are traveling to the US anytime. Maybe who knows, we can